Right, so good afternoon, everyone. Um, I just should warn you before I start that when I showed my presentation to my panel members, they basically all said, "You can't say that." um, I decided I could, and I'm just warning you in advance that this may not be what you're expecting, but I think it's important because I think policy about vaping is largely driven by youth vaping. And I think it should be driven by the evidence and not by emotion and moral values. And what I'm going to talk about is actually evidence, or at least the best evidence we have today. I want to start by saying, though, that kids shouldn't vape or smoke. They shouldn't drink alcohol, use illicit drugs. Of course, they do lots of things they shouldn't do. But in the real world, the world as we see it now, we have to provide a solution. Some kids are going to vape. And what I wanted to do is just make a pragmatic risk assessment, looking at the health benefits and risks of vaping to guide what I think should be rational policy. I'm going to discuss 5 issues. The first question is, are kids who have never smoked vaping frequently? And we've heard about the numbers of kids who are vaping, but are they never smokers? Because this is our main public health concern, kids who've never smoked who are now vaping. And are they vaping frequently? Because they're the ones who are going to be exposed to new toxins. But most vaping by this population is experimental. It's short term, and frequent vaping is rare. We've just seen a study come out in Australia. Yes, a third of 14 to 17-year-olds currently have vaped in their lifetimes, 16% in the last 30 days, but only 3% of the total kids who are vaping vape frequently using the CDC definition. Half of those were smokers. So this is sort of consistent with the evidence from other similar Western countries, the latest evidence I can find of kids who have never smoked, who are currently vaping frequently, and it's mostly 1% to 2%. So very few kids who have never smoked are actually vaping frequently. And I think that's really important that we distinguish that from the total number who are vaping. I think we all agree that vaping is not a significant gateway to smoking. Of course, kids who vape are more likely to later try smoking, marijuana, binge drinking, and lots of other things. But we don't believe that vaping is causing them to take up smoking. And there's general agreement that common risk factors are the explanation for that later take up of smoking. And if there was a significant gateway, we would expect to see smoking rates going up. And of course, they're going in the opposite direction. And in the US, as we know, when vaping became popular, smoking rates continued to decline. And in fact, they've declined faster than they ever have compared to the historical period before 2013, since vaping became available. So we think that vapes and cigarettes are substitutes. And when you try all sorts of things to reduce vaping amongst kids, you get more smoking. And I'm talking about increasing taxation, strategies to reduce access, and flavour bans. Yes, you may reduce the number of kids vaping, but you have more smoking. So overall, I think it's reasonable to say that vaping is diverting kids away from smoking. If there are some kids who become smokers because they vaped and who otherwise wouldn't have, that's far outweighed by the number who are going in the opposite direction. What about nicotine dependence? Well, of course, some kids will get nicotine dependent, but only a small minority of never smokers will become nicotine dependent. We don't have a lot of evidence on this, but the National Youth Tobacco Survey was analysed in 2018. They found that less than 4% of never smoking high schoolers who vaped in the last 30 days had signs of nicotine dependence. Kids who've never smoked vape less frequently. They don't all use nicotine. And of course, vaping is less addictive than smoking. And apart from that, what is the damage from nicotine dependence? And we might talk about that later. What are the known harms of vaping nicotine? In kids, there's been a certain amount of research. Most of the kids who have never smoked vape infrequently, so their exposure is quite low. The research has found, yes, in animal studies, in cell studies, there are harmful pulmonary effects. But in the real world, in human studies, there's very little evidence of functionally important respiratory damage, no association with the onset of asthma. There's no evidence that vaping harms the human adolescent brain. It's not good for rats. It doesn't harm the humans. It doesn't cause EVALI and a whole range of other scary things that we're told about. Burns are very rare. Of course, there may be long-term problems, and we're not discounting those, and we need to monitor those and be vigilant, but they're likely to be at an absolute level very low. Controversially, yes, there are benefits from vaping, and this is one of the reasons why people smoke. There are benefits from nicotine. Nicotine creates pleasure, relieves anxiety and depression, and kids use vaping for that reason. The 2021 National Tobacco Survey found that the most common reason for vaping was about 43% of kids said because of anxiety, stress, and depression. That's a positive effect. We know, certainly from adult studies, vaping improves attention, cognition, does have an effect on weight control, as Mara has pointed out. It improves ADHD and schizophrenia, nicotine. And kids use it for social acceptance, to be part of the group, social lubrication. So there are benefits. And if you're a smoker who switch, there's a huge benefit. So that brings me to the risk-benefit analysis. And I want to say from the beginning, kids shouldn't vape or smoke. And I'm not condoning the use of either of these products. But I would say that based on the evidence as I see it, the benefits of vaping outweigh the risks at a population level. And I have a set of scales as well. And on my scales, the weight favours the diversion from deadly smoking as probably the most important factor here. The diversion of smokers to vaping, away from smoking, I think is a very important factor. And the benefits of nicotine are all positives, which we need to weigh up in this balance. And we need to weigh that against the fairly modest known harms of vaping. And I've listed those. I really think there's a lot of emotion and moral judgment about those. The evidence doesn't support that being a major concern. Yes, there's nicotine dependence, which is unpleasant. It's generally brief, but in itself, I would argue that it's not a great concern when you consider the 8 million people who are dying from smoking that we could be helping. Thank you.
Good work. Good, Beth.